Baxy's Musical Podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions. Canna Provisions is an adult-use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Massachusetts, with locations both in Holyoke and in Lee. They offer a warm, unique shopping experience with guides rather than bud tenders. And in fact, they're not just a dispensary, they're a destination. Visit cannaprovisions.com. Cannaprovisions.com. Please be over 21 and please consume responsibly. And now it's time for Baxy's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast.
Of all the bands that came out of the UK, 1976 and 1977, a very strong case could be made that none of them were as original or as mysterious as the band Wire. This was a band that was post-punk about 10 seconds after punk began in the UK. While the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Damned were cranking out singles and making headlines, it was Wire who was far more interested in expressing themselves artistically. They didn't look like punks, they didn't sound like punks, and yet they were lumped into the same nebulous category simply because there was no other way to define what they were doing. And so, when they released their incredibly influential debut album, 1977's classic Pink Flag, there was no denying the importance of their music, even if it defied classification. Their next two albums, 1978's Chairs Missing and 1979's 154, were equally amazing. But they never released hit singles, and they never made it to top of the pops. And I think that was the point. They didn't have to. After 1979, Wire took an extended break, but came back in 1987 with a vengeance, and then would release 14 more studio albums. And this month, Wire will release a fully remastered collection of bootlegs that were recorded as far back as 1978. This new collection, entitled Not About to Die, is fantastic. And if you've ever heard the original bootlegs, the remastering is astounding. And the man who spent the last 46 years as the longest-serving member and principal songwriter of the band is my guest today. It's Colin Newman of Wire. This is a wide-ranging interview where we go on to talk about the band, the music business, the Sex Pistols, touring, a new documentary, and the long-standing collaboration with his wife, former Minimal Compact bass player Malka Spiegel. With the band Githead and Immersion, they also do a radio show together called Swimming in Sound. This is my conversation with Colin Newman of Wire on Baxy's Musical Podcast.
Hello, Mike.
Hey, Colin. How are you?
Good, and you?
Good. I just spent some time talking to your wife today, Malka. She was absolutely lovely to talk to.
Well, she is lovely to talk to, and I know she was a bit confused actually because I thought we could have done it straight after mine.
We could have, but like any man in his 50s, I needed a bathroom break.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Let's not belabor that point.
But anyway, no, I had a great time talking to her, and I've become, as I was telling her, I was becoming a big fan of the collaboration between the two of you, and we'll talk more about that. But please thank her for that, because I mean it was really a lovely conversation with her. I really appreciate it.
Malka, I mean, I think since we started doing our radio show, I think Malka's just ability to just talk in these kind of situations has just really, really improved. It's been a great kind of means of her just being able to just, English is not her first language, and she's not always been comfortable about talking about what she does. And I think she's got just way better with it. And I'm really delighted it worked.
I've been listening to Not About to Die for the last couple of days. I was given a preview copy of it, and as a long time fan, I have to tell you that it's just fascinating to listen to this album. And the story behind it is really interesting too. These were initially illegal bootlegs of Wire songs that were that had been recorded prior to Chairs Missing and 154. Tell me about that bootleg. How did it get into the wrong hands, and how did it reemerge for you?
Well, actually, that's how did it got into the wrong hands is a question I don't know the answer to, but it was normal back in the day for demos to circulate on cassette, and EMI insisted, as record companies did in the 70s, that we would demo every single song that we were intending to record, so that they would, before we would be allowed into the recording studio, we'd have to provide demos of the songs that we wanted to record. So there is a complete set of demos of pretty much all of the material that ended up on the first 3 albums, and they were all initially re-released by us for the first time legally on the special editions of the first 3 albums we put out in 2018. Obviously, they were expensive items, and they're all pretty much gone now. And you know, you have to be you've had to have been a fairly hardcore Wire fan to really have initially bought those. The story of Not About to Die is, of course, something completely different. I remember in the sort of mid 80s, we were starting a tour in New York, and there was a guy called Peter Wright who used to work for Mute. He's still very much involved in the music industry, and he lived in Alphabet City. We're talking mid 80s. Alphabet City was rough. I mean, really rough. And we all kind of turned up to his place because we liked Peter, and we wanted to kind of hang out for the afternoon. And there was a guy doing crack on the doorstep. This is one of those images that you kind of remember. So he lets us in, and then he holds up this record and says, "Listen to this. Everybody's got this." And we were like, "What's that?" And then it's like everybody said, "Oh yes, our demos." I mean, typical of a band, you know, it's like nobody is initially thinking, how did they get those? And somebody is making a load of money off of, you know, our work.
Right.
There were various demos that actually got released, but they were mainly of live recordings. And this was, I think it's the only bootleg of studio demos. I mean, someone might know a different answer to that. There are Wire nerds out there who know way more than I know. So basically, I started to think about what ownership of your own assets actually means. I mean, this has been a big story. It's a defining story of, you know, this decade for Wire.
Right.
Because in 2017, Wire became the owners of our own 70s catalog, not the 80s catalog, the 70s catalog, which is basically the classic catalog. And it was a long story how it happened, but I was really, really determined to make that happen, and I figured out in the end how to do it. It was greatly helped by the fact that EMI went bust and Britain was still in the EU at the time, so EU monopoly laws would not allow basically one major to acquire all of the assets of another major. That means the number of majors in the market went from 3 to 2 at that point.
Right.
And there were monopoly issues, and you know, it was an interesting thing to do, and it just occurred to me that wouldn't it be like, it would be an interesting comment on A, the fact that Wire owns this, and B, the difference between now and then. I mean, in a way, the sort of, when you think about something like, not only were record companies back in the day, I mean, they still are, largely exploiting artists. The only ones that really don't end up being exploited are the ones who are really successful, who have good enough lawyers to make sure they're not exploited. But not only being exploited by the record company, but exploited by freeloaders who are basically bootlegging your stuff.
Right.
You know, this is, you know, it's like artist victim. You know, I mean, you do your work in good faith. I mean, our demos were not really intended to be heard by anybody. I mean, we were just playing stuff. We were just literally demonstrating our material. And, there were things that we changed our mind about,
Yeah.
for various reasons. But what those people who put together that original bootleg did was they went through it's quite a lot of material, all those original demos. There were like, I don't know, 7 or 8 sets of demos. It's a lot of songs.
Hmm.
And they went through and picked out all the ones that didn't get recorded, in a sort of final version, and all the ones which were significantly changed by the time they got to the studio. So in terms of a Wire fan, that was a very pop selection.
Yeah.
They chose the ones that the Wire fans would be interested in because they wanted to sell a load of their bootleg. And but then again, that means it's almost becomes like a ready-made. That's the item. That is the item. It's exactly the same item. It's obviously the audio sounds considerably better because it's not being mastered from cassette.
Right.
And we poshed up the sleeve. I wanted to keep the sleeve looking roughly the same because, there is part of this which is just a big finger up to the original people who did. We're never going to find out who did it. And I very much doubt whether somebody's going to say, oh, I'm sorry, guys, we made all this money. Here's a check for like so many thousands of dollars. Yeah, that's not going to happen, in the real world.
Well, what's really interesting about the final result of Not About to Die is, and you hit on it, and I think this is really the thing that I like the most about it is there are versions of songs that really appear to be in their infancy, and
Yeah.
like what finally got on those albums, Chairs Missing or 154. It's like they're totally different songs. It's almost like this is an album of purely new music, even though
Yeah.
it's not. I mean, these are all old songs, but I mean, that's what is so fascinating about this is to see how the germination of these songs started and what they would become. That to me, that is totally worth the expense of buying any record of any bootleg at all.
Yeah. So absolutely. So that I think it very much captures that. Only this time round, wife can benefit from the income from it. But I mean, artistically, there are some other things. I mean, we have a promo team who do things like pick the kind of, I'm doing air quotes here, singles. I mean, there are no real singles these days. There are tracks which are pushed ahead, and they were the ones that chose Stepping Off Too Quick. Stepping Off Too Quick, the reason why Stepping Off Too Quick didn't end up on 154 is because it sounded on one level like a throwback. It sounded like it was a track that could have come just after Pink Flag.
Right.
But on the other side, it has this like expansive opening to it, which is, which makes it into this kind of a whole other thing, descending bass line. That's very 60s psychedelic, actually. And of course, once you're away from all of the fashion ideas around music of the time, we're not in that period anymore. We're definitely not in that period anymore. You can divorce it and say, well, that's a really good piece. We should have recorded it properly. But I mean, it stands as a good testament. And if it became amongst the canon of more popular Wire songs, I don't think that would do anybody any harm.
No, I don't think so. I read an interview that you had done recently talking about something to the effect that that opening sequence in that song was the best opening sequence of any song ever recorded.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, that's a sort of comedy. I mean, I said it as a joke, but at the same time, it's a great opening sequence.
It is. It's fantastic. That's what's so. And I agree with anybody who would say, well, why didn't you record that? Say on the Ideal Copy or a Bell is a Cup. If a song that great that took this long for the world to see, it's almost a shame because it is a really strong song.
I think well, by the time we started doing with the 80s thing is a completely different question. But the 80s was Bruce's idea was year zero. There's a rather in hindsight a rather unfortunate choice of phrase, but because of that was what Pol Pot used with the decimation of his people. But yeah, the idea was that we wouldn't do anything from the 70s. So in the 80s, we didn't play anything from the 70s. But that was a sort of generational thing, and that was a condition of the 80s because, you know, when a band will, they'll come up and they'll have the band and the fans are kind of the same. They're
Yeah.
all the same age, and they kind of go with them. And then when they come round to sort of later on, if the band still has all of the same fans and no new ones, then that's a kind of stagnation. And I think that we felt that somehow instinctively, without ever really saying it, that what we wanted to do was, in a way, make new friends and go somewhere else with the music, be more. We were always interested in being contemporary, so I think that's kind of the reason. But that's a very, very long subject, which I shouldn't spend too long talking about because we'll never finish.
My introduction to Wire came in the 80s. In fact, I saw Wire play in Milwaukee. This would have been 87, 88, somewhere around there. And I remember walking out of there just being completely mesmerized by what I had just seen. And in fact, the next day, I bought all three of the records: Pink Flag, Chairs Missing, and 154. I bought all three, and at that point, Wire has had me since since then. So to go back and to listen to one and compare the other was really interesting. But one of the things that I've always felt to be true of Wire, I think, I don't know if it's the media or music fans or whatever it may be. There's always this need to classify everybody. And even though you guys came out in 1976, 77 during punk in the UK, you guys were post punk about 10 seconds after punk began. And I think that's the amazing thing about Wire, is that you were so unique at that time that it's almost impossible to really call Wire a punk band at all. You were so different than what was going on back then. What was the reaction people had to Wire in those early days?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of British context is a bit different because obviously, I mean, I don't think anybody from Wire had ever regarded that Wire were ever a punk band at any point in the trajectory. It's one of those words that gets thrown around, punk. What does it mean? And it means that generationally, it means different things to different people. So we talk about the specifics of Britain in 1977, 1976. I mean, the Pistols broke in 76, and they so represented the whole idea of punk. And they also inspired a lot of bands who sounded more or less exactly the same as they did. So anyone who was a little bit smart was thinking, hang on, we don't want to be the same as them because they exist already. And so we kind of thought, okay, let's go somewhere else and do something a bit different. Also, Wire original lineup, we were I was the youngest in the original lineup, but Bruce was quite a few years older than me. So Bruce and Rob are kind of the older ones,
Hmm.
and we couldn't pretend to be 17-year-old, on the dole living in flats. I mean, everybody had been to art school. Everybody had been through an education, the education system. We were all, you know, educated people. I mean, there was a whole thing of people would sort of they would play dumber than they were,
Hmm.
and that wasn't really so interesting to do. So, yeah, I think, I think really, to be honest, it was in many ways how Wire ended up getting a record deal was because EMI got their fingers burned with the Sex Pistols, because the EMI was kind of almost a national brand.
Right.
And when when they did, I don't know, they did something, I can't remember, whatever outrage they did or whatever, the women at the factory making the records refused to work on them, and the boss of EMI, who was, some kind of lord who hung out with the Queen or whatever, was like, yeah, we can't be releasing this. And the A&R department of EMI, or certainly Nick Mobbs, who was the person who signed us, was like, oh my God, we've just signed the most important band of their generation, and now we're having to drop them. We need to find the next thing. And we were manifestly the next thing.
Yeah.
I think that was how they saw us. And it didn't do any harm that early reviews said we were like the Pink Floyd of punk. Well, Nick Mods was the guy who signed the Pink Floyd, and when he brought them in the door at EMI, everyone was like, like, these people are getting nowhere. They're a bunch of scruffy hooligans, and they ended up doing but Dark Side of the Moon and making a very large amount of money for the record company, so that people were trusting him. So we look weird. Our songs, people thought our music was hard and harsh. And I don't know, people in general, it sounds ridiculous. I mean, right at the beginning, I don't think anybody liked us very much. I mean, there were a few people. I mean, people like John Savage liked us because they liked our attitude. But I mean, the punks hated us because we would play fast, but then we would play short. So a fast short song, you can't get a good pogo going. And then we played slow. Slow was really, really, really against the rules. You weren't supposed to play slow at all.
Yeah.
On that level, and on the sort of the level of the sort of more official side, the sort of record company side, they didn't get it at all. They didn't really understand it. But somehow we managed to convince a few journalists that it meant something. And Pink Flag is still selling, man.
Yeah.
So we must have done something right. It's very, very hard to, if we had like 5 or 6 hours, I could explore this topic from like n different directions, because I feel like I'm sort of, I don't mean to sound in any way like kind of pretending I'm not understanding of what's been done, what the band has done, and all the rest of it. The reality of it very often is things just happen.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you're being evasive at all. In fact, I think you're being actually very kind, because I think I just finished, for example, I just finished watching the Danny Boyle series about the Pistols.
Yeah, I thought you'd bring that up.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm only asking you about it because, on a contemporary level, you were kind of, around there. I don't want to say you were terribly involved in any of
no,
it.
I saw the Pistols. I saw the Pistols 4 or 5 times in '76.
Yeah.
Probably in early '77. So I saw the Pistols a lot of times. They were amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the show is kind of like a Disneyfied, fairy tale version of what happened, or at least that's what it appears to be. And it's hard to tell, what's right or what's wrong.
Yeah,
about it.
that's a generational view.
Yeah.
There was a review in the Guardian in Britain who said it was like a carry-on film. Carry-on films are like, I don't know if you know, it's a kind of, vicar nidge, wink wink nudge nudge kind of humor, which was very popular in Britain in the 50s and 60s. I mean, the truth is that they were a comedy act. They were a comedy act from the beginning. They never took it that seriously. I mean, Malcolm took it seriously. I think the band were just like doing well. I mean, I remember seeing them. I can't remember which gig it was. I think it might have been that there was this punk festival in the 100 Club that the World and his wife claims to have gone to. Well, I was definitely there both nights. And I remember there was this moment when Glenn Matlock they were obviously that, the band was starting to get good. And he was kind of looking at John Lydon with a kind of smile on his face. It's like, wow, this is great. Kind of, like you do. And John Lydon just scowled back at him. It's like, you're not allowed to smile. And it seemed like, okay, I see what's going on here. I mean, it's and it's fine. They were. I would always describe them as a generational divider. I mean, but you were either with the Pistols or you were old. That was
Right.
that was basically how it was. And but it so quickly turned into they already were a parody of a rock band, but then they kind of by 77 they become more or less a parody of themselves. Which was a more difficult thing to deal with. But Wire had already started by that point. I could give a flying, whatever. I won't swear because I know this is a broadcast thing. About the Sex Pistols, that there was a point when the Sex Pistols became really boring. It was just
Yeah.
stuff in the newspapers,
Yeah. Well, I think like any band that gets successful or obtains any level of notoriety, I think you're right. It's very easy to become a parody of yourself, and I think that's what certainly happened to them. And of course, they imploded as a result of it. But the bands that would follow, I think are really significant, and Wire did that. Sex Pistols had one very good record. You guys banged out three brilliant ones in a row. And I think anybody who has studied that genre would agree that Wire definitely stood out in the and the quality of those records just kept improving, and there kept there was development in what you guys were doing, as opposed to so many other bands at the time that were just so stuck in a rut, and wallowing in in specific rules about music. That has never been the case with Wire, whether it was in the 70s or the 80s and 90s, and even as far as your later releases. You never just decided to be compliant, or complacent, rather. You just continue to move forward. And I think that's one of the reasons why I appreciate Wire as much as I do, and so thank you for that.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously, thank you for the very kind praise. I would say, in general, there's a problem with genre music. I mean, genres are great when they're being created, and genres are great when they're being destroyed. But people who just play genre music are boring. How many? You can see go to like a heavy metal gig where you have kids of 14 and all of the band's merchandise all looks the same. And everything is the same. They all do the same thing. And it's like, it's because there are rules that you have to follow. A punk very quickly became that. Punk became something which, in the narrowest definition, was just you have to do this, and this. These are the rules of it, and you're not allowed to break any of them, which of course becomes orthodoxy, not freedom. And if you're really interested in artistic freedom, then you don't really want to be stuck in any kind of orthodoxy.
Right.
That's how I would see it. I mean, me personally, I hate being identified with either punk or even post-punk, to be quite honest. I think there's an awful lot of dodgy post-punk. And I just think I find those categories kind of depressing. And the music I like is, as a listener, is really broad. I like a huge swathe of music.
Right. Well, I think the reason why you guys have been placed there is because there's no other place to place you. I think
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, yeah, that's. I mean, it's kind of interesting that now the other thing that's happened in this decade is a kind of understanding, because Wire now owns its classic catalog, and streaming has gone from being something which just a few people did because they wanted to access to all the music that's ever been released, to something which a huge number of people do, but they're not interested in all the music that's ever been released. They just want to hear the Rolling Stones or whatever's popular. Wire is now seeing an unbelievable interest / income from its 70s catalog, which is just people still like it's nearly God knows how many years old it is now. It's going to be 50 years old by the end of this decade. I mean, for God's sake. But it's a niche, and yeah, we're not like Pink Floyd or the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or somebody like that, but within our kind of niche, there is nobody can say nobody gets what Wire is, because a lot of people seem to get it very well. I mean, and they it's comfort listening.
Yeah.
The reason that they're listening to Pink Flag because they want to hear something familiar. And it's a kind of crazy period. There's a whole thing here about classic catalog and streaming, and most artists don't own their own catalog, so they don't really understand what's going on. Because I run Pink Flag,
Right.
I know exactly what's going on, and I see what is coming in. And it's just unbelievable because, the label gets the majority of the money. Well, the label gets the majority of the money also in the case when you're a signed artist. You see, and the thing is that those big artists like your Bob Dylans and all the rest of it, they've got good lawyers, so they've managed to get good deals off the back end. But I will guarantee you that there are artists who are bigger than Wire who are seeing a fraction of what we're seeing, because they're still on the same royalty percentage they were back in the days of the 70s or the 80s when they signed those contracts. Because a lot of the labels now, they're owned by third parties. You think of any classic label, think about Island from the 60s. Island is not owned by Chris Blackwell anymore. It's owned by some major company, and all of the artists that are on that label, none of them have a personal relationship with whoever owns that now.
Right.
Chris Blackwell would have been involved in making sure that the bands, they made interesting records and all that. With indie labels, there was always a to and fro, a relationship between the artist and the label. Now it's just assets owned, and increasingly those assets are owned by companies that aren't even record companies.
Right.
They're
Well,
just
well, let me ask you this, because I mean, you're seeing this a lot now, especially with what would be termed as legacy artists, the Bob Dylans, the Bruce
yeah.
Springsteens, where now or Neil Young, for example, where they're selling the rights back, to their catalog for astronomical fees. I get, I guess in my mind, if you are of a certain age, there's only so much that catalog can bring you at this stage in your life, that maybe it's worth sending out. But for like a young guy like a Justin Timberlake just sold his. I mean, the guy's, I don't even know if he's 40 years old yet, and he's selling his back
Well,
catalog.
is he selling his? He doesn't. It is highly likely, because all of those people have sold their publishing. They haven't necessarily. They don't own their catalog.
Yeah.
Because they haven't got that to sell. But they will have the publishing, because the other thing. I mean, this isn't very technical, but the thing with digital music is that everything is calculated automatically. So that means all of the people who make money out of streaming, out of Spotify and Apple Music, nobody is sitting there adding it all up. It's just computers making the calculations of what they've been told to pay out. And the record industry, back in the early days of digital music, made the major players, who were Apple Music and Spotify, do something which has been very beneficial, especially to legacy artists. And that is the publishing comes off the top.
Right.
So publishing money in the classical days, a record company would pay the basic money for publishing when they pressed records. Obviously, and that means it's relying on the record company to actually pay that money over and tell the truth about how many they pressed. Whereas with digital, the record company never sees that money. It goes straight to the publishing company. So that means that that percentage of the income is going direct to the publishing company, and those artists will be on somewhere between 70-80% of that income.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have been seeing a lot of income from that. And if I was Bob Dylan and I'm getting all this money coming in and I'm looking at that thinking, God, those records are like N years old and I'm still around and the money's still coming in. And after I'm dead and gone, that'll still be coming in. Am I going to leave a mess for my family to fight it out over who gets what? Or am I going to take the money now, share it out and say, all right, guys, you've had it? I think literally that's what people are doing. I think that they're thinking, Wire is doing something similar. We're doing it a different way.
Yeah.
But the legacy thing is kind of important because you've got your family, and what you don't want is to leave a big mess with everybody fighting everybody else, saying, "Oh, well, I'm," I mean, there's I don't think there are any illegitimate children in the Wire family, but some people turning up saying, "Well, I should get this," or "I'm important," I should, and legal battles between family members and different family members from different members of the group.
You don't want to be part of the Prince family.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
this is this is incredibly important to deal with these issues, which is dead boring. Have got absolutely nothing to do with music appreciation.
No, but it is interesting stuff, and it's interesting to hear from someone who who lives this stuff, and this is how you make your living, and it's interesting to get a real educated point of view from it, because for fans, we just we don't really think about what it means to have that kind of asset to work with, and what that means to just sell it off. So in a real profound way. I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk about it.
Well, the other thing is of course that because a lot of artists don't own their own catalog, it means that they are making record companies or the owners of those assets very rich. A friend of mine who works in one of the major labels literally in metadata. Metadata is the data which is used to calculate digital royalties.
Yes.
And he said to me, he said, "Wow, you're the first artist I've ever spoken to that understands any of this." I said, God, they must be making a lot of money, those labels. He said, they are making obscene amounts of money. There is a tsunami of money coming in from classic catalog, and it goes right across the board. If I know what Wire is earning, Wire is a very little fish in this pool, then boy, there must be artists out there who aren't even aware of the fact, or there'll be plenty that aren't aware of the fact how much money is being made out of them, because they seem to be getting something every month, or whoever's, every 6 months or something like that.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, because one of the ways that other artists make their money is through touring, and obviously, with COVID, that has interrupted Wire touring. I know you guys were touring with the last album from 2020, Mind Hive, which by the way is a great record, but the pandemic interrupted that. You guys provided refunds rather than schedule for dates that may or may not ever happen. But from your perspective, uh, do artists really make that money back on touring, or is it much more of a complicated process than that?
Yeah, the finances of, I mean, I can only talk to what I know. Okay, with in terms of the business of Wire, I've really for really since 2010, I think I've kind of been pretty much dealing with that, and we were surviving off a combination of releases and touring. Basically, that's pretty much the combination of every band that goes on the road, and I've seen in this period how a lot of bands are desperate to get on the road. I mean, absolutely desperate. I mean, we're really good friends with Holy F. Can't say the full name because of the swear in it. And they were they really need to get on the road. They did a British tour back in April. First date in Leeds, some guy starts coughing all over them.
Mm,
By the time they get to Brighton a week later, 3 of the band have got COVID.
yeah.
Punchy, the bass players throwing up in the toilet after the show. You know, it's just that's the reality. That's what people are going through, and you've also got it's a very difficult time coming up because you have what they refer to in Britain as the cost of living crisis, which is the fact that everything has got energy has got more expensive, and because of that, food has got more expensive. There's inflation in all major economies of the world. It's not just America. Britain
Hmm.
has it quite seriously, and what means is if people are spending more money on their basics, they have less disposable income. And if they're going to be going out to gigs, they're going to be a bit more selective, or maybe they're not going to go to any. Maybe they just go to some.
Hmm.
You've got a combination of still COVID reluctance from an older audience, plus cost of living crisis, plus the fact that all of the staff had to find other work. The staff in the venues and everything had to find other work during the pandemic. And so a lot of those haven't necessarily come back. And the ones that have come back want to get paid more money. And so it's cost more money to put shows on, but bands want to earn the same money from the shows because they need that income, which means the ticket prices has to go up in a situation where everybody has less money. I mean, it's not a doomsday scenario because all these things are nuanced, but now this year is not a great time to really, really need to be touring.
Right.
So I yeah, Wire's not touring this year, not for that reason. There are lots of other, Wire is not, it's not a perfect setup, but I would say that I think there are definitely people who think we're like super smart not doing anything because it makes us look cleverer than we actually are. But the truth is that certainly with the American dates, Botch, our agent, and I took the decision to pay everyone back because we'd initially thought to reschedule, and then was like, there's rescheduling, and then in the end we were like, yeah, come on, let's,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that everything is connected to everything, and what you're talking about is exactly you know, it, it validates that. You can definitely see how, you know, how the smart decision probably is just to sit and wait, and when the time is right and the economy does soften a little bit, then you go out and then you do what you got to make a living.
I also think the weird thing about Wire is when it doesn't do anything, it gets more famous. This is just the most ridiculous thing in the world. Who would ever quantify this? That is not a strategy, but it's kind of the truth. But we will, I think, as and when, if, and that is more of an if than a will be. I think that we will find a strange circumstance. I think that the success of the classic catalog at streaming. has a big catalog. Pink Flag has a big catalog. I mean, it's not just the early 70s or the 70s records. It's also, everything since 2000 as well. So there's and all Wire things sell. Wire just it doesn't all sell in vast amounts, but it all month on month it all sells. I mean, we're perpetually remanufacturing physical products, streaming, digital sales, they just happen. It's not something you can't. I don't think that's anything you can kind of create. That's not a piece of marketing or anything like that. That's just the reality of it. It's for real. So next year is going to be an interesting year because I think finally we will get the documentary.
Oh, wonderful.
There's a career-wide documentary that will come out, and this will be a kind of interesting thing to see, if we're still talking to each other after it, and secondly, how people will take this. But I think this is a way I would, from my point of view, as the sort of the label, if you like, I think, well, this is a very good thing it's how would I describe it? It's a bit like a sort of retrospective exhibition. I think it's that kind of idea to place the band's work, all of it, in context of all of the rest of it. And I think if that works out, then I think it will be a great thing. I really haven't seen. I've seen a couple of little bits that really they're not close to the final edit yet. But and obviously everything got really delayed with COVID. So yeah, it was a difficult one.
I can't wait to see it. That's one documentary I will not miss.
Right now, the most kind of important thing that's going on here is for me as an artist, and for Malcolm as an artist, is the fact that we have a weekly radio show. It's fundamentally changed our attitude towards music in a way which is quite extraordinary. I mean, I spent from basically 2010 to 2020 constantly firefighting. I mean, but there always endless activity and trying to keep up and try and keep on top of it. You don't, when you're in the midst of all that, have the chance to really step back and listen to other people's music. But why did you get involved in music in the first place? It was other people's music. It's because people made great records. Yeah. I've always been a record person more than a live person. And being able to go back and sort of discover music of now, to discover music across every genre, to be able to have the discipline to create a weekly show every single week. We've done a show. It's just about to come up for 2 years. And we are, I'm just immensely proud of it. This is, it's the main thing I kind of wanted to mention, really. I think more than anything over the last 2 years, this has really changed me as a person, and I know it's changed Marco as a person, and we're different artists because of it.
The name of the radio show is Swimming in Sound, and swimmingandsound.com is the website that you can check that out on, and it's very, very cool. It's a really cool show. Colin, I really do appreciate the time today, and best of luck with the new record, and best of luck with the radio show, and thank you again to Malco. We had a great conversation earlier today.
All right. Thanks very much, Mike, and look after yourself.
You too. Thank you very much, Colin. Take care now.
All right. Cheers.
The name of the new Wire album is Not About to Die. It is fantastic. Also, check out Colin's radio show with his wife, Malka Spiegel, Swimming in Sound. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to review it, rate it, share it with all your friends. You can reach me at backs@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. And again, thanks to Canna Provisions for their support. You can support them by going to cannaprovisions.com. Thanks again for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.